Hi, I'm Ike Ellis, and now we'll talk about migrating an on-premise SQL Server database to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, a PAAS offering in Azure. So we've already looked at an introduction to Azure. We planned and prepared a migration. We migrated to a virtual machine, which was an IaaS offering, and now we're going to look at our first PAAS migration. We'll do it in this video, we'll do it by hand, and in the next video, we'll do it by script. So, who is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance for? In our introduction video, we spoke briefly about how it plays in our making a choice about the product, and then in like the third video, we talked about how it competes with AWS RDS. But let's take a deeper look into Managed Instance, how it works, what you can do with it, and what some of the limitations are with it. So if customers are looking to migrate a large number of apps and databases into Azure with minimal changes, this might be your best option. What's the advantage of Azure SQL Database Managed Instance over a VM? Well, Microsoft manages the upgrade of SQL Server, where in a VM, you have to upgrade SQL Server. For anyone who's ever upgraded a SQL Server, you realize that is a huge, huge benefit. I've done upgrades to SQL Server for many, many years, and it is always a multi-week or multi-month project with lots and lots of testing and lots of work. And then you hope that it all succeeds, and you almost never want to do it in place. But with Azure SQL Database MI, Microsoft does it for you, and you use database compatibility to determine your database version. So if you want to stay on the 2017 version of the engine until you're ready to move to the 2019 version, you can do that. And then when you're ready to move, it's just, an option to switch over. Now you're on 2019. So that's a pretty astounding way to manage versioning, particularly with multiple databases, because you can have some databases that you switch the version over and others that you don't. You also deploy it into your own private VNet. So with ExpressRoute, all communication with MI goes over the VNet. By default, TLS is enabled. In fact, you can't even turn it off. So all data exchange from your clients to managed instance is encrypted. Why that isn't the default with SQL Server, I don't know. I don't know why anybody would do anything with SQL Server that wasn't over TLS. It seems crazy to me. And it's really full featured. So all of the compute and storage is provisioned on demand. You have fast and online scaling, so if you need more power, it's available to you. Microsoft handles the updates and patches. You get backups with health check and point-in-time restore, so you can configure your point-in-time restore to I think past years, right? And definitely weeks and months in the UI. I'm trying to think back on the UI. You have 99.99% availability, and you have disaster recovery with a single geo secondary, but there's also multiple in business critical. You have compliance with all the major industry standards. You have threat detection, meaning that's SQL injection detection. So if your application is susceptible to the SQL injection, MI, actually Azure SQL Database in general, will detect that and alert you that it's happening. You have intelligent query processing and automatic performance tuning, just like you do with SQL Server 2019. You can monitor at scale with intelligent insights, and you've got data discovery, classification, vulnerability assessment. So there's a lot of great features available to you in MI. And again, it's important to Microsoft that you know that the SQL language is 100% compatible with on-premise. So you can deploy your database to managed instance and not really have to make any code changes to your application. That's not strictly true. Like any cloud service, cloud services fail over on you, and when they fail over, your application might lose connection. So it's important that you have like retry intervals and things like that in the application, and if those aren't built in, you need to add those. But other than that, like if you're using JSON support in the application, MI will support it. If you're using the CLR, stored procedures in the application, MI will support it. And like I said, you deploy this to private IP addresses, and it's very easy to understand the pricing, although I think it's a little bit on the expensive side, but it's available to you. So these are the things that Managed Instance is compatible with. You can use cross-database queries. Those are those three-part database names where you have, table names where you have like database.schema.table name. You can use three-part names in Managed Instance. You can't really use them in Azure SQL Database. You can use linked servers with SQL. So your on-premise SQL Server can link to your Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and you can query back and forth. Like I said, you can use the CLR, you can use Service Broker, change data capture, transactional replication. All of these features are not available in Azure SQL Database, the sole PAAS product, and only in Managed Instance. You also have R services and distributed transactions. You have access to file stream and file table and Polybase. Managed Instance is deployed into its own subnet in Azure. You use ExpressRoute to connect to it from on-premises. Your applications get hosted into a different subnet, and then they can connect to the Managed Instance subnet. Power BI uses a public IP to get to Managed Instance, and it's pretty neat. It gets its own subnet. It needs to be an empty subnet when it gets deployed. Only Managed Instance can share a subnet with another Managed Instance. Managed Instance has two different service tiers, general purpose and business critical. This slide is a little out of date, actually. Business critical is released, by the way. So general purpose is cheaper, business critical is a little more expensive. General purpose has a Azure Premium Storage. Business critical has super fast local SSDs. We'll look at that in just a second. General purpose doesn't allow in-memory OLTP, while business critical does. So right here in general purpose, you can see that you have active compute nodes and redundant nodes in the background. So it's architected a little bit different. The redundant nodes are not accessible to the Azure, to any Azure applications. Business critical, though, looks more like an always-on availability group. It has SSDs that are locally attached to the replica. It doesn't need to go back to a storage account. So if we go back, by the way, to general purpose, you can see the compute nodes are attached to a storage account. Business critical, they're not. The storage is locally attached, and then it uses availability groups to replicate data between the nodes. These nodes are read-only secondaries. So you could offload your reads to the secondaries and make sure that the reads do not block the writes in any transactions. When you offload reads from the writes, you gain a lot of performance because the reads will block the writes. So when the reads are no longer blocking the writes, you can do a lot more writes on the primary. And the reads don't block each other. So if the reads are all reading off of the same secondary, they're not blocking, they're just reading all the time. So really using a read-only secondary is a huge performance gain, particularly in a high-load transactional system. SQL database can deploy as a single database, an elastic pool, or a managed instance. We'll look at more about Azure SQL database, the single and elastic pool in the next video. But for now, this slide is there for your reference so that you can see some of the differences. Here are some links to deployment resources if you need to learn more about deployment to managed instance. There's a lot of information to cover. This isn't about deploying managed instance, but there are a few things that you should probably know. For instance, virtual network considerations. Remember that we have to build our networking inside Azure, particularly if we're using ExpressRoute or a VPN and we want our own private network, which is a best practice because we don't want to deploy a SQL Server, on the public internet, right? So There are some rules that you need to be aware of when you build a managed instance as it relates to networking. The first thing is when you build the subnet inside Azure, it needs to be totally empty. Managed instance will not deploy to a subnet that has even one other resource in it. You also need to have sufficient IP addresses. The subnet needs to have 16 IP addresses available to it. And that is, so as I was saying, managed instance needs 16 free IP addresses in the subnet. Azure uses 5 IP addresses in the subnet for its own needs, and then for general purpose, each instance needs 2, and we have multiple, and each business critical instance needs 4. So you want plenty of free IP addresses for managed instance. Don't run out. If you run out, you are going to be upset when you try to deploy another managed instance in the same subnet and you can't. So give it plenty of IP addresses if you can. So like I said, a managed instance must be deployed in an Azure virtual network. Plan your deployment. Like I said, it needs 16 IP addresses. You need to do some things as it relates to routing. Now, I don't expect you to do that, but you're going to have to hand it off to the infrastructure guys. NSGs on an MI subnet are not supported. So calculate the subnet size, assess the needs of the rest of the VNet, disable service endpoints, create a new ARM virtual network in case you need to redeploy for whatever reason. Okay. So like I said earlier, managed instance is always on the latest and greatest SQL Engine version. You control what version of the optimizer you're using by using the compatibility level. You can test to see your engine addition by doing a server property engine addition. If it equals 8, that means you're in managed instance. If you want to, here's a link that I left on this slide to show you the T-SQL surface area. So I think you'll find that it's like almost 100% compatible. So if you want to know if your database is going to work in managed instance, you can use the Database Migration Assistant and the Database Experimentation Assistant, like we kind of saw a little bit earlier. I'll show you DEA in a future video. And then you could do a migration, right, and just not cut over to it, and then test your applications on it and see if it works. That's always a good idea. So what's missing from managed instance? Well, there's a few things missing. For instance, Windows authentication doesn't work. We use Azure Active Directory authentication as an alternative. We don't have management data warehouse. We don't use database mirroring, of course, because that thing's dead, right? We don't use extended store procedures. We use the CLR. So here's a list of just things to watch out for. On the CLR, remember with Azure SQL Database, we don't have the CLR, but with Managed Instance, we do have the CLR. But it's still a platform as a service offering. You don't have access to the operating system, meaning you can't shell out to the operating system. You can't create an assembly from a file. You can only create an assembly from binary. Alter assembly can't reference any files. Well, it kind of makes sense because those things require a local file path, and you don't get access to the local drives at all, right? PAAS isn't going to give you access to like the C drive or something like that. That's not going to happen. You do have access to SQL Server Agent, which is good news because Azure SQL Database does not have SQL Server Agent. So you can migrate your jobs just like you saw me do it in a VM, the same way in Managed Instance. It's always running. It's built into the product. Forwarding SQL Server Events is disabled because you can't forward the events into the event log, right? You don't have access to the event log. As far as the connection is concerned, the alias local host server is predefined for managed instance, where an on-premise SQL Server agent is allowed to be configured. You can't configure it in MI. You can create jobs using the UI or T-SQL. You have an alert system. You can send email with alerts, but you cannot call SQLcmd. Now, you can use SQLcmd to connect to managed instance as a client, but SQL Server Agent jobs can't use SQLcmd. You can use Service Broker within an MI for sure, but you can't do cross-instance Service Broker. Database mail is supported. In your stored procedures, you can send email just like normal. You have replication support. You have snapshot replication and transactional replication. Both are supported. You do not get merge replication. You do not get to use an Oracle publisher. You don't get to use peer-to-peer replication. There are some restrictions when using a managed instance. For instance, you can't have updatable subscriptions. The publisher and the distributor have to be on the same location. If the publisher and distributor are in managed instance, Azure File Share is used to share the data and schema from the publication. You can't use just like a drive like you would normally. If you're going to do replication, when we said that the distributor and publisher have to be at the same place, this is what we mean by that. So if you look at the diagram in the upper right, you'll see that you have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance with a publisher and distributor on the same managed instance, both in Azure. Now you can have a subscriber also in Azure and a subscriber on-premise on a SQL Server on-premise. You can split up the publisher and distributor, but if one of them is managed instance, they both have to be managed instance, which means you can put them both in Azure and then have a subscriber in Azure and a subscriber on-premise. Or you can keep the publisher and distributor on-premise and then have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance as a subscriber and have an on-premise subscriber. Why would you do all of this? Well, you're doing it for data locality, to keep the data close to the application. And you're also doing it, for a little bit of fault tolerance so that if one goes down, you still have a copy of the data someplace else.
I'm going to show you how to use Azure Data Migration Services from start to finish. We're going to move a database from SQL Server 2008 into Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. And we're going to watch how it works in real time and how it can move a database with very low downtime. So the first thing you do is you create a resource and you type in migration. And then you'll get a list of options, and we want Azure Database Migration Service. So when we click on it and we click create, it asks us for a few things. The first thing is our subscription, then our resource group. I created a resource group where I have the Azure SQL Database Managed Instance in it, and I also have a VM in it with 2008 and a database there. So I select that one, and then I enter a service name, and I just might use PAAS demo 2019 Ike to be unique, and we might put migration in there too so that we know that it's there. And then I put a location, and the location I'm going to place it in is the same location that I know I have my other services in, West US 2. And then it says which pricing tier would you want, and you can configure the pricing tier. I'm going to select premium here, and then you can choose the number of vCores that you want to use. For my vCores, I actually don't have a big need for the demo because the database is very, very small. So you can just choose the minimum if you'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply. And then you can look at the networking tags if you need to. My managed instance VPN is over here, so I can choose that one so that I make sure that it's being used on the right one. And then just click review and create, and it shows you all of your options, and you can confirm them and click create. Now the thing about this is the deployment takes quite a long time. So I'm actually going to stop the video and then start it again once the deployment is completed. Thanks. So remember that our goal in using database migration services is that we are moving this database, Tailspin Toys, from SQL Server 2008 over to this managed instance that I created that doesn't have any databases. And our goal is that we want to do an online migration with no downtime, which means that when we do the migration, it's effectively going to use log shipping, but it's going to restore the log so that other logs are prepared to be restored over it until we're ready to actually make the cutover. That's what we're doing. So before we can begin, what we want to do, by the way, is once you've created the migration service, it's going to come up just like this, and you're going to want to click New Migration Project. But before you do that, we need a service principal, and we also need to collect some information so that the service can back up and restore our database and store those files in a storage account. So I'm going to show you how to create the service principal and collect the appropriate information that you're looking for. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to enter into what we call the Cloud Shell prompt. So in your portal, you'll see a Cloud Shell right here at the top. Please click that. And then in the portal, we want to see an account list. So the way we'll get that account list is we'll just type in AZ account list -- output table, and we'll click enter. And what we're doing here is we're just making sure that we understand which subscription ID that I'm using. And I really only have one, but some people have more than one, so it's important to know which one you're using. And then once you have that, we're going to type in a command. And this command, and I'll leave it on the screen for a second, is going to create a service project with an app ID and a password that we can use in the database migration assistant. Now, what you'll notice is that my subscription ID right here, this is that what I want to do is I want to take the subscription ID from the earlier command. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to grab this subscription ID out of here, and then I'm going to paste it right there. Okay. And then the resource group is actually the resource group that I've been using for all of my projects. And you can see it right here. So if I copy SQLmd West US and I go to the end of this command and I delete this prompt, I can just copy that there. And now when I click enter, it's going to go and create a few things, and it's going to drop back and respond to me with a little bit of JSON. And the JSON that I care about will be the app ID and the password. So I want to capture those values in my response here. Okay, it errored out the first time, but that might be okay. What I found is that just because it errors out the first time, if you just go ahead and run it again, it's often successful the second time. I don't know why. See, it worked that time. So now you see where I have app ID here. I'm going to take all of these values. Actually, that's fine. It's probably easier to do that and just save it off into Notepad so that I can use them later. Okay. So the next step I'm going to do is just to make sure that that AZ role assignment actually has contributor permission. And so I'm just going to paste a quick command here, a role assignment, and I'm going to create that Tailspin Toys role that I have is a contributor. And now once I've done that, I can exit out of the CLI and I'm ready to begin a new migration project. So I'm going to click New Migration Project. So for project name, I'll just enter PAAS demo. And then I'm migrating from that SQL Server 2008, the VM, to managed instance. So I'll check managed instance. Now for a type of activity, you can do an offline migration, which is just a simple backup and restore, and the database will be available to you. But for us, what we're going to do is an online migration, which is more like log shipping. It'll restore the logs in a mode where new logs can be restored over it until we're ready to actually do the migration. And I'll click Save. And then once I've got everything selected correctly, I'll create and run the activity. Now, it's going to collect information about our source and target and databases and some migration settings about how it's going to get a hold of the backup files and where it's going to save the restore files. So for us, it's asking for an instance name, but I found that if you use the Azure portal and you go to your virtual machine, which is what I've done here, you're better off just using the public IP address. So I'll go back and just enter the public IP address. And then for Windows authentication, I'll use the SQLmd user account that has local admin permissions to that VM, and I'll click Trust Server Certificate and click Save. Then it's going to ask information about the target, and that's when we need that JSON that we had before. So what we'll do is we'll use this as the app ID, which was in our output, And then for the key, we'll use the password setting here as the key. And then it says, okay, which subscription and which MI server. So we'll pick the right MI server. And then it asks for the SQL Server username and password. This username is one that I created earlier. That was SQL MI user. And then the password, I'm just going to copy in from another screen so that you don't see my password. And then I'll click Save. And then it asks which database are we interested in moving, and it's the Tailspin Toys database, and we'll click Save. And then it says, where can I find the BAK files that we're looking for? And those BAK files are it's in a share that we created earlier on the SQL Server. So we're going to just put that path to a share that we already have, DMS backups. And then it says we want to impersonate a user account, and I don't know why it always puts that old key in there, but that's not the one we want. The one we want is the SQL MI user, this one. Yep, that one. And then the password is probably fine, but just in case it isn't, I'll copy it back in so we don't get an error. Okay. And then it asks for a storage account, and we'll pick the right storage account. So in my case, it's called SQL MI Store with a bunch of unique characters so that there's no conflicts. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. We'll call the activity name PAAS Demo. We're looking at the target server name is fine. The source server name is fine. And we'll click Run Migration. Now, you'll get the activity kind of coming down here, and you can just click refresh, and you can see like, okay, full backup loading, log shipping in progress. You can kind of watch it. If you click on it though, you'll get even more information. So it's now uploaded the database backup and the TRN initially. And then if you refresh, it'll tell you that it's restored. So if you come down here and refresh our databases, you can see that it's restoring a database right here, which is fine. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a record to the game table just to prove that we're doing an online cutover. So I just go ahead and run this insert and just prove that that record got added. You can see the PAAS demo game is there. And I did that in the original source server just so that we can prove out that the cutover, that record actually made it in an online fashion over to managed instance. Now, just real quick, we're going to do a quick TRN backup. And we're going to do that so that log shipping sends that log file back over to the managed instance while we do the cutover. Is this button right here. And it says, when you're ready to do a migration cutover, perform the following steps. Stop all the transactions, right? I mean, you're going to basically move the database. So the application is going to go down for just a little bit. So if you're ready for this, we're going to go ahead and confirm and click apply. We can see that it completed. And now we can come back here and we can see that it renamed the database to Tailspin Toys. And if we open it up and we look at the game, you can see that our new record has replicated over there. So that's how you do an online migration with Azure Database Migration Services. And I hope that was really helpful. And I'm sorry the demo blew up in my PAAS Summit Precon, but hopefully this helps everybody who attended. Thanks. Have a great day, guys. Thanks. Let me know if you have any questions.